Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where it's about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Snowpiercer. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, we're literally picking up after last week's episode with all the Breachmen dying. Obviously, Boki, he's the only one that's a survivor, but that's obviously to fuel the rage even more, because now everyone believes it was the Tail that did that. Andre was trying to tell Boki that it wasn't, but it doesn't matter. Like, the flames were already stroked ahead of time. Like, obviously, this was a powder keg ready to explode at any point in time, and all they needed was Wilford to, light the match. So all that progress they made, it was already teetering to begin with, and Wilford just aggravated that and now just sent the whole thing up in blaze. Obviously, you even had that voiceover from Bess at the beginning. For her, it's like, what's 8 lives to the 7 billion? This is different. The 7 billion were lost to the cold. These 8, this is us. We're killing each other. We're turning to violence. And it's just like, for her, it's just, she's tired of it all, and that's why she's also making, that's why this case is so important to her, because it gave her purpose. And it's just kind of like, she's lost right now and she needs to kind of find her way. And this is her way to finding herself, especially because Andre's got so much to deal with that he's leaning on her, and she wants to prove herself to not only him, but I think to herself that okay, I'm here, I'm doing all this for a reason. So obviously they now know that Wilford's got enough people on this side for them to simultaneously strike and kill 8 brakemen at the same time. So that was obviously interesting. Obviously, you have Bass continuing her investigation into things, even finding a Wilford pendant, but it's like a very old school one. So she actually goes to Oz and LJ not wanting to help him because she's enjoying the chaos, because I think for her, she looks at this as an opportunity. Hey, also it's kind of middle fingers to Andre for everything he did, kind of turning her life upside down. To be fair, she was already a bit of a sociopath, and it seems like she just enjoys the game. But it's also like, hey, I get to come out on top, because the moment Wilford comes back and takes control, I'll be kind of there because I'm someone he knows from back in the day. But interestingly enough, they end up talking to an older lady. Oz ended up hooking up Bess with this lady. She collects a lot of antique stuff, and it turns out there was a particular jacket that had a sister jacket very similar, and it's like, who got it? And it was that lady from First Class, which we've only seen her pop up once this season, but it turns out she was the one responsible. And you could tell a moment Bess sat down with her, you could see, even though she tried to put makeup to cover it up, you could definitely tell she was bruised. It was had a bruised eye. You're like, oh, yep. She's definitely responsible. So it's like, yeah, you tried to kill Cherry, but Cherry was strong and she fought back, huh? And Bess wiped away her makeup. And it wasn't until she was like, oh, it's been right here in front of you. And I looked at her necklace. I was like, Pastor. I was like, I freaking knew it. Something didn't sit right with me the moment Bess met that dude, but also the way he was talking last episode sounded like he had something this train needs a new shepherd or something like that. And obviously hearing that lady talk like that, it clicked all the pieces together for Bess. It's like, that's why these people are so devoted. Obviously it's he's the one leading them, and it's hey, saying our shepherd, that being Wilford, that should have been a key sign. Because at first I wasn't sure what he was implying, whether he was saying maybe Bess or at least someone else should be in charge. That should have been the sign, but obviously for Bess, she wasn't thinking clearly because the pastor was there. He helped her through what she was going through. So it's no, she was, I think, suspicious of him at first, but then it's oh, he helped me. He was actually helping me along. So if that was the case, he could be with Wilford. But for her to find out that he wasn't one responsible, because for him, it's the rage that Bess feels. He's I felt that too. And for him, it's this train needs someone to lead it. But she's 8 lives. He's 8 lives is a small price to pay for peace. This train wanted stability. He will bring peace. He will kind of settle everything, And I think it's just a situation of, because even for Bess, it's was everything that happened alive? Were you just putting up a front? But he's no, I legitimately want to help you, because I think he saw in Bess a kindred spirit, but obviously she doesn't agree with what he's done, because it's she's not all about, like, obviously all the death and destruction was enough for her. It's like you're aim for peace. It's like we went down this route before, and you want to judge Andre for what he's done, but it's like you're no better. Like, you've killed 8 people because you think, but it's not going to stop here. So many other people are going to die. Hell, tailies were about to be hurt because of what you set in motion. So it's like there was going to be no peace. There was going to be more death to follow. So it's not like he's saving everyone, but in his mind, it's like, what's a few lives, if it means peace at the end of the day. But obviously for her, Beth started beating the crap out of him. Obviously their last fight, she kind of had the upper hand anyway, and now she gets, like, she knows his moves better, ends up getting on top of him, punching him. He's like, do it. And she's like, oh, I'm not going to kill you, because if you die, no one's going to know the truth. He tried to kill himself. Granted, he expected to be a little two-faced from now on. Interestingly enough, very, very actually befitting, actually. But only half his face got frozen. Granted, we don't know what that means in the long term, whether he went into a coma after, but we saw that he was kind of struggling to breathe, so it's not clear whether he's dead or not, but I think, like, that part of his face is always going to be completely frozen and just messed up. Granted, that also includes, like, probably most likely half his brain. Who knows how that whole thing works, whether or not he's dead or whether he's going to be in a coma after that. That's the last time we see of him, but he might be dead, and it might be a situation where it's like, well, for one, they still don't know who the other people are. There's at the very least, that's at least 2. We know that first class lady, or maybe she was second class, whatever, her and the woman that attacked Bess. That's at least 2. There's at least 6 more out there, not unless he was part of that simultaneous strike or not. So there's at least 5 or 6 other people out there. We don't know who they are, but we know he was the head honcho getting orders from Wilfred. I wonder who reached out. I mean, because maybe the pastor was someone that has a past. Because even an older lady who gave Bess the info, it's like, oh, she knew Wilfred from back in the day. It's like, oh, like, she's like, yeah, he's kind of like my nephew. Took him, to the chapel. Oh, he loved the chapel and stuff like that. So it's like, maybe the pastor. I mean, a lot of people on that train, Audrey, Roach, Ruth, were people that were hired directly by Wilfred, so who's to say, like, the pastor wasn't as well? I mean, in retrospect, I'm so stupid. The chapel, it's like, oh, he loved the chapel, so that's most likely where he met the pastor. Now, whether that's from their younger days or when he got older and eventually kept going to the chapel, he eventually met pastor. It's like, I'm so stupid for not necessarily correlating that. When I'm literally saying it, it took me saying the word chapel over and over again, be like, right, pastor, chapel, stupid me. So that might have been them even kind of winking to it even earlier in the episode of, like, that should have been a key sign. I didn't even think about that just now. Regardless, that was an interesting development. A lot of other interesting elements to this, too, is obviously, like I said, the tail. A lot of people have turned against the tail, and it's like, well, what do we do under these circumstances? A lot of people from the tail are like, we need to get to the back of the train, like, to get back to the tail, close borders. Obviously, they can't really rely on Pike because Pike's not in the best place. Hell, even Andre says, yeah, I think I messed him up, like, doing what I did, like, because for him, at least he fought, like, if he has to kill someone, if it's in combat, sure, but that's not how things went down with Terrence. It wasn't really full-blown combat. It was an assassination, and, it wasn't honorable, at least if it's, like, self-defense, defending for my life, it's one thing, but killing someone out of that, like, maybe it has something to do with Pike's past, the reason why he was kind of reserved like that. And Andre kind of psychologically messed him up. He's not in a good place. He's like, no. And he's like, I've tipped the scales. I've looked at the scales, and Pike is coming out a little bit more on top. You owe me. You're the one that's got the mark. So I think it was him trying to be like, you're the one who stayed, and not me. It's like, it's time for things to be Pike's way and not him kind of getting the short end of the straw, whether it's like, hey, the whole cannibal thing, the whole being put in a drawer thing for such a long period of time, but then getting brought out, and kind of going against Andre for a while, but then, like, it's like, okay, we're on good terms, but now it's like, you asked me to do this and cross this line and be your assassin. I'm sure that weighs heavy on him, especially with the whole... I'm sure Zara probably feels bad, too, because she's the one that kind of leaned him further in that direction of he should do it. It was kind of a necessary thing. Granted, we haven't seen what the aftermath of that's going to be, because that hasn't come up yet about, like, oh, yeah, Terrence is dead. We haven't really spoken about that. I guess it's just kind of like, I guess it kind of got lumped in potentially with what happened to the Breachmen, because there was at least one that was like covered up, and I'm wondering, is that supposed to be like Terrence getting like lumped into that as well? Like there was one body that had like a brownish cloth covering, so I don't know whether that was Terrence or something else. So like I said, I'm curious like how, because there was no like outrage about that necessarily this episode, so there's that side of things. But obviously, this whole circumstance also leads to the whole conversation about, like, well, Ruth has to explain to Andre, Roach, and Zara about the whole Audrey thing of, like, okay, so is she on our side or not? And it's like, well, whether or not she is, her being one of us and being over there is going to look like she betrayed us, whether or not she actually has. And so, you know, obviously they contact him later on, and it's like, oh, it's Audrey, okay? It's like, oh, they think I'm holding you hostage. Tell them it's not the case. She's like, I'm not coming back, not yet. And I think at that point in time, honestly, Audrey was split on not really knowing where she wanted to go. And I think that's a big part. This episode, a lot of people at first didn't really know where they were leaning. I think quite a few other people did know where they were leaning. But, so obviously it's like, well, we got to assume she's compromised. So obviously the bastard taking delight in it when they're contacting him and he's acting like, nothing's wrong, and he's not saying anything. It's like, oh, hey, is that you, Ben? It's like, yes, you sociopath. But what I thought was really interesting too is Ruth kind of, you know, for her, she, you know, she's thinking back to, like, you know, the way things were, because for her it's like, obviously, Wilford last episode offered her an opportunity to come over, but she chose not to. And for her, it's like, in the past, I would have jumped at that opportunity, obviously. But now Roach is like, you're not too sure. Because for him, even being like, yeah, like, you're calling me Sam, so things can't be that damn good, you know? You know, trying to figure out whether they're making the right choices or not. For her, it's like, yes, those 7 years, it might have been Melanie, but those were still Wilford's law. There was some order, you know? So... But Roach is like, okay, do you want to go back to that? Freezing people's arms, the you know, that whole thing. Like, do you want to go back to that? And you can tell Ruth kind of doesn't want to. And I thought it was really interesting because basically this episode makes her fully confront that, because obviously she's hiding out with Lights and some of the other people from the tail and runs into Winnie. And it's like, oh, hey there. Oh, why are you scaring me? It's like she remembers you from the tail. She's like, I've never really been back to the tail. You froze her mom's arm. It's like, oh, Suzanne, right. And she died of complications of that. Obviously, Ruth was like, wait, oh. Like, she didn't realize, like, once again, because what went down in the tail, she wasn't aware because it wasn't her business. It's like, oh, like, she looked at the tail as others and less than a little bit. You know, she enjoyed, in her mind, it's like, I did my job. I thought what I was doing was right and everything. But it hit her to be like, oh, I didn't know that, like, this little girl doesn't have her mom anymore, and it's because of me. And then, you know, Zara's like, what about her brother? Her brother died in a war. And it's like, for her, it's like, damn, like, this little girl has no one now. So when the time came to find Winnie, she goes out herself, like, I'll be the one to do it. And she ends up finding Winnie, and is like, admits, you know, talks about the fact that she lost her mom when she was around Winnie's age. And it's like, I took your mom for you, and that was wrong. I thought I was doing the right thing, but it wasn't. It was wrong. And I wish I could take that back, but I can't, you know? And that was really, I thought that was so interesting because Ruth, out of anyone, loves Snowpiercer. She will fight for Snowpiercer. She's always been for Snowpiercer, you know, but obviously Wilford returning kind of complicated things. But for her, it was a thing of, oh, like, you know, she thought like Wilford was great and everything. That's why she was so excited for the open dialogue. But obviously it shows she was conflicted. And now I think she's chosen Andre and them over Wilford, because I think for her, she realizes like, yeah, that was me, you know, following Melanie, but those were Wilford's rules. Like, I did something. She, once again, in her mind, she justified by being like, it was right. It was the right thing to do. I was following the rules, but just because it was the rules doesn't make it right. What I did was messed up. So she was able to get Winnie back to the others. But obviously Andre finds out that they ended up taking, so at the time he didn't know it was Pike, because Pike was wandering off on his own, thinking like obviously he's not in a good headspace, but because he's a telly, they take him. They're planning to lop off his freeze and break his arm. But Andre's like, all right, you mad at him? This is on me. I'm the one you hate. Go ahead, take my arm. Because for him, it's like after what he did to Pike, it's like, no, I have to be, you want to take someone, you want someone to take responsibility, let it be me. And he was offering up his arm. But Ruth, thinking about the Suzanne, was like, no, stop it. This is barbaric. This is your leader. You chose him. You want to go about things differently. You want someone else in charge, then use your power to like kind of lean in that direction. But don't do this. This is us backpedaling because things are different now. This is how things used to be. This isn't who we are anymore. And for Ruth to come into at the end like that and save Andre, yes, they've had their differences, but it's what Melanie said. If you are truthful and have Ruth on your side, because she'll tell you what's what. Because even Andre was like trying to do what he could to save the tail, but even he was like, yeah, Ruth is right that me saying what I said is going to end up having an opposite effect. So, because obviously it alienated a lot of people, but being like, oh, Andre's not looking out for us. He's looking out for his old buddies in the tail. Even he was like, you're right. Everything I did for to make sure the tail kind of came first. So it's like, I deserve your punishment more than anybody, So I'm curious what this means for him and Pike, because Pike is probably going to be like, this isn't settled. Things between us is like, you didn't have to do that. It's like, yeah, but I owed you. And I'm not saying that we are good. I should have never put you in that compromising position, but here we are. I have to live with, like, you're not the only one that has to live with that. I have to live with the fact is that I put you through that. I caused you that damage. So it's going to be interesting to see where things kind of go on that front, but definitely what it means for Andre and Ruth going forward. Because I think going forward, he's going to be a lot more open about things going forward with her, realizing like, Ruth, you saved my life, so I've kind of kept you out in the dark about a lot of stuff, like been reluctant to get your help, but it's like, no, like you came through at the end, like obviously you're about change, about doing, like obviously now it shows him like, oh, she's not Team Wilford, she continues, she is Team Snowpiercer, but not Team Snowpiercer Wilford, just Snowpiercer in general. So I think that's definitely going to change Andre's mind going forward, so I'm interested to see that development. On the other side of things, like on Big Alice, obviously you have Alex kind of being on the outsides, of Wilford, and I think that's the problem about Wilford, and that's kind of a theme with the Big Alice thing, is him reminding Alex like, oh, like I saved your life. You should be grateful every day, like every breath you take should be a constant reminder of I saved you from the cold. It's like, and even Alex being like, I shouldn't have to choose between you and Melanie, and he's like, yes, but it is a choice, that it's like, oh, you spent 1 week with your mom and you think, it's like, no, like, don't forget, I'm the one that saved you. She didn't. She left you behind. I saved you. And the fact is that he's holding that above her head, like, you should always be indebted to me because I'm your savior. I'm your God. Like I said, he has that very egotistical God complex he has. And, and that's obviously his thing. It's about having control over people. And we see that a little bit with Audrey. Like, obviously, Audrey was a little flip-floppy because for him, it's like not good enough in the sense that when she was like, I'm not coming back yet. Like, for him, it's like, no, that's not good enough. He doesn't believe her that because when she says, like, oh, yeah, like, there's a connection between us, she's like, I don't get it, but it's there. But he's like, I don't believe you. So he takes her to see Kevin, which I was like, oh, snap, Kevin's still alive. Granted, Kevin is mentally broken because of everything. And he needs Audrey to do what she does. It's like her whole thing is connecting with people, kind of, as she says, connecting them with what they lost. So she kind of brings Kevin back because she talks about like, oh, look, Kevin, like I get it. You're afraid the pain is getting to you. But honestly, and the way she was talking immediately, you're like, oh, how she's talking to Kevin about how like, oh, your life was nothing before Wilfred. Like the fact is there's nothing more powerful than that loyalty. The fact is that proof is that you're willing to cut yourself like that means you're willing to do whatever he needs you to do. Whatever you are his. You are nothing without him. You were nothing before him, and you were nothing after him. He is kind of your everything. And initially, when you hear her say that, you're like, oh, like, is she talking to Kevin or is she talking about herself? It's actually both. I'm assuming like he got in her head and very much was like that. She kind of, I think that's why she's been so scared, because she thought she had Wilfred where she needed him to be, but obviously he pulled her back in. And like that seduction of kind of giving your all and being everything to someone, kind of like that feel, that connection, it's toxic. It's intoxicating more specifically. And sadly she got seduced by, and to the point that she fixed Kevin. I mean, and basically made him, not just. I'm wondering the way they're setting this up. It kind of seems like in the way like later on she's just like snapping and like come, and it's like, hey, lick Wilford's slippers, and it's like he's like a trained dog, and he's like, oh, I'm so glad to have you back. So part of me wonders, is this what Audrey did for Wilford long ago? Like she was able to kind of like break and rebuild people. I figured as much, like doing what she is able to do. I figured that would be a necessary thing for Wilford. So it's like, oh, like she's able to sway the minds and hearts of people to where Wilford needs them to be. I figured that's why he needed Audrey. But it's also like, you're my number one, so I need you by my side. So, but to see that side of Audrey, to see her like that is kind of scary and sad. And I don't think there's any pulling her back from that. Not unless this is a long, long con. It could be, but I don't see that. I think they lost Audrey, and I think she's potentially going to be the deadliest weapon in his arsenal, especially considering Wilford is who he is. He is really good at the mind games and the manipulation, and having someone like Audrey on his side is just going to amplify that even more. Like I said, I think with her, he can break people like he broke Kevin and have Audrey rebuild them to be. So it will devote, like, because up till now, people's loyalties are questionable. With what Audrey's able to do, it's like, oh, you never have to question their loyalty for you again. They were willing to do anything for you. Whereas obviously there are people in Big Alice who still have their reservations. I wonder, has Sykes gone that far, or is she just kind of like, no, like I'm just loyal through and through? Still doesn't mean she. I mean, the reason why Kevin went through that was because his loyalty slipped up when he ended up eating those wings, but kind of showing weakness in front of them. So no one else probably has quite done that. At least the only people we're aware of that's like that is Audrey. We don't know if that's necessarily happened to anyone else. But I mean, even Audrey says that's proof of how much he likes you. He wants to keep you around, That's kind of his mark on you, his sign that like, oh, we'll always be connected. I guess that's what the whole in the bloodbath is supposed to be. Kind of like, we're coming together. Like we're one. This is supposed to be us as one type of thing. I don't know. But obviously, as we see at the end, obviously there's the lighting of the lanterns, which honestly, the cinematography in that scene was actually pretty dope. But just like obviously the train spiraling like that, and like kind of seeing all the I don't know, that spiral and seeing every bit of the train like that. I was like, honestly, that looked sick. I just love that. But then we find out what, obviously going back to the red lanterns are supposed to be connected to Wilford. And obviously when it came to Roach and his family, his wife being like, do we light up? Do we agree for Wilford? And Roach is like, I honestly don't know yet, because he doesn't side with Wilford, but it might be a thing if it means protecting his family. He doesn't know how this whole thing is going to pan out. Obviously, Wilford looks and sees everything. Him and Audrey are there, and it's like, hey, everything works out. The fact is that the entire train is on our side, and obviously Alex, whole thing doesn't sit too well with her, but it's like, that means the train is now more Wilford's. So he kind of got what he wanted at the end of the day. Everyone on a lot of people in Snowpiercer leaning his direction. But then also telling Sykes, get Icy Bob ready. I'm like, now for what purpose? Is this connected? Are we actually going to go back to what I thought we were going to, where it was like, oh, Icy Bob is going to be sent out to kill Melanie? I mean, obviously you left her, like I said last episode, I figured that's the more right punishment for her in his eyes, because it's like, hey, you abandoned me and left me to die to the cold. I'm doing the same thing to you. So I don't see him doing that. So begs the question, what other purpose does Icy Bob serve? It also explains, once again, Wilford got the control of the train, and I think this is the beginning of that, because when it was all said and done, the people kind of have chosen, and like what Ruth said, this kind of works out in their favor. So I'm curious what this means for Ruth and Wilford going forward, because she kind of made her choice to a certain extent. So she's not going to be all team Wilford. So we'll see how that plays out. But this also explains once again why the train left. I figured it's like, oh, Wilford somehow got control of the train, so leaving Melanie behind, despite everything, because it's like, oh, because regardless of what Melanie ends up discovering or finding out, it doesn't matter, because for him it's all about like, hey man, I got my train back, I'm in control, I'm head honcho now again. That's all that matters to Wilford. So I'm really interested to ultimately see where all this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, love life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.